I'm a legend. I'm a legend. I'm a legend.
Hey guys, Brian here from Thumper Fab. Today I'm going to walk you through installing our new long travel kit for U10 PRO. For the first steps, we went ahead and lifted the vehicle up. We're going to take the tires off, all the factory control arms, shocks, and the factory tie rods. With your wheel and tire removed, we're going to go ahead and drill out the rivets that fasten your brake lines to the upper control arms. We'll repeat the same process on the front. I'm using a 1/4-inch drill bit. You want to drill through just enough of the rivet so that you can free up the brake line from the control arm. With your rivets drilled out, you can use a flathead or other similar tool to pop up the push pin rivet that goes into the upper control arm. With this, our brake lines and emergency brake cable are fully free from the upper control arm. Now we'll go ahead and repeat the same process on the front of the vehicle. We'll go ahead and drill out the same rivets on the front upper control arm. This will allow us to disconnect our brake line from our upper control arm. You may need to pry up, and this will free up that portion of the brake line. We'll go ahead and drill this back one and begin the disassembly process. For the next step, we're going to disconnect our tie rod from the knuckle. I'm going to use an 18mm wrench. With the cotter pin removed, we're going to go ahead and loosen up our castle nut that fastens the tie rod to the knuckle. Once we have it fully removed, you can lightly hit the knuckle in this region with the rubber mallet, and that should free up the taper on the tie rod that's holding it into the knuckle. For the next step, we're going to remove the cotter pins on the upper and lower ball joints. Once we get those cotter pins removed, we can disconnect the ball joints from the knuckle and the brake line from the knuckle. We're going to go ahead and hang the knuckle up from the vehicle so we can remove our shock and our control arms and get everything prepped for our install. With your cotter pins removed, you can go ahead and remove the 2 castle nuts using an 18mm wrench. Once we have those nuts out of the way, we can go ahead and lightly tap our knuckle to free up the tapered fit of the ball joints. Before we disconnect our knuckle from the ball joints, you're going to want to go ahead and remove the banjo bolt that fastens your brake line to your front calipers. As you can see below us, we've went ahead and placed a drain pan on the floor to catch the brake fluid that'll come out of our brake line. Once we have this out of the way, we'll remove the castle nuts that fasten our ball joints to the knuckle and hang our knuckle free from the vehicle so we can fully remove our control arms. I'll use the 12mm socket to remove our banjo bolt from the front brake caliper. Just a reminder, as you loosen this, brake fluid will come out of the brake line. You can go ahead and grab your banjo bolt and crush sleeves and set them aside. With our lower ball joint disconnected from the knuckle, I'm gonna go ahead and run our little ratchet strap over our frame tube. We'll use this to hold up on our knuckle assembly while we complete the removal and install of the new control arms. This will make it significantly easier, and this way we don't have to disconnect our brake caliper from the knuckle. With our ratchet strap loosely installed, we can go ahead and tap the knuckle in the tapered section for the upper ball joint. Once we get that free, we're going to slide the knuckle off the axle and hang everything off to the side. We'll go ahead and hang our knuckle out of the way. It'll make it easier to remove our control arms and our OEM axles, as well as the tie rods. Shock from our upper control arm, you'll use a 15mm socket and an 18mm wrench. For the next step, we'll go ahead and disconnect our sway bar from the upper control arm. We'll use our 15mm socket, simply unthread it. You'll want to save this nut as it'll be reused later on. If you have issues removing the nut from your sway bar, you can see there are flats machined in the sway bar end link. You may have to grab that with a wrench to prevent the whole link from spinning when trying to remove the nut. For the next step, we'll go ahead and remove the bolt that fastens our upper control arm to the frame. There's one long bolt that runs through this whole bushing tube. We'll use the same tools as before, and you'll slide your socket through this hole provided in the front of the plastics. Once you get your socket on the head of the bolt, you'll want to go ahead and reach around, get your wrench on the nut on the back side, and simply remove it. Now we're ready to remove and set aside our upper control arm. With our upper arm out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and remove our axle to give us better access to the bolts that fasten our lower arm. You'll simply just want to grab it firmly and pull it out of the diff. For the next step, we'll use our same 15mm socket, 18mm wrench, remove the two bolts that fasten the lower control arm to the frame. With your mounting bolts removed, you can go ahead and remove the lower control arm from the frame and set it aside. Next, we'll remove our upper shock mounting bolt. Since we're reusing the OEM shocks on this installation, we'll have to install our OEM shock relocation kit. We'll use the same 15mm socket, 18mm wrench to remove the upper mounting bolt for the shock. We'll go ahead and set our shock aside for reinstallation later on. There's a metal band clamp that you have to knock off with a large flathead screwdriver that holds the steering boot to the steering rack. Since we test fit tie rods on this already, we have the inner tie rod loose. That'll allow us just to simply unthread the inner tie rod. With our front torn apart, we'll go ahead and repeat the same process for the rear. The first thing I'm gonna do is remove the cotter pin from the axle nut. I'll use our needle nose pliers. I've already straightened it out. What can help is if while you grip it tight with the pliers, you can tap it with a hammer to get it started. That way you have more to grab on the bottom side. You may need to wiggle it around some, or even stick the pliers in the eyelet of it and hammer it out. You want to be careful not to hit the lugs though on the wheel studs. Next, we'll go ahead and remove our axle nut. For the next step, I'm going to go ahead and disconnect our sway bar from the lower control arm, followed by the lower shock mounting bolt. With our lower shock mounting bolt removed, I'm going to go ahead and remove our upper shock mounting bolt. Since we're doing a shock relocation kit on this installation, you'll need to fully remove all 4 of your shocks. With your shock fully removed from the vehicle, we're going to go ahead and remove our upper knuckle mounting bolt. We use our same tools as before. You'll want to be sure and save your hardware, as some will be reused during installation. We can now remove the rear lower knuckle mounting bolt. You'll want to be careful as the knuckle might slide off the axle. Once we remove this bolt, we'll go ahead and tie up the knuckle for reinstallation later on. With our knuckle mounting bolts removed, I went ahead and tied it up out of our way so we can finish removing the control arms. For the next step, I'll go ahead and remove our rear upper control arm. This will have the long bolt that passes all the way through the frame. Now we can set our upper control arm aside and move on to the lower. We'll repeat the same process on the lower control arm, the only difference being the lower control arm is mounted with 2 bolts as opposed to 1. For the last step, we'll remove our OEM axle, and then we'll begin the modifications and installation process. Just a reminder, when you're taking your rear suspension apart, you don't want to unmount the caliper from the brake rotor or knuckle assembly. This here is for your parking brake, and it'll seize up, making it where you have to take the whole unit apart to get your caliper back over the rotor. As you can see here, we've just left everything connected. In the rear on these U10s, we don't need to replace the brake lines for the long travel kit. What we are going to do though is create some slack in the brake lines. So I'm going to pop this rivet here and this push pin, which will give us some extra flex in the brake hoses to better fit our long travel kit. Here you can see the extra slack we created in the brake line. What you can do is you could go ahead and remove these P-clamps off the brake hoses, as we'll use zip ties to fasten them to the control arm. While we're working on the rear of the vehicle, I'm going to go ahead and install our rear shock relocation bracket. The first step you'll want to do is you'll take your short spacer out of the hardware kit for your shock relocation kit, and you'll slide it between the 2 flanges of the shock bracket. It may be a little tight, but that's good as the spacer won't rattle around. We'll get that spacer in place, and we'll use the OEM shock bolt to fasten the bracket in position up in the frame. As you can see here, these are labeled with either a D or a P, which will help you know if it's a driver or a passenger side bracket. Once you have your spacer installed in between the flanges of the bracket, we'll slide our bracket assembly up inside the frame into the OEM shock mount. You'll use the OEM shock mounting bolt to loosely fasten the bracket to the frame. Once you have it slid all the way through, you can cap it off with your lock nut, but you'll want to be sure not to tighten anything up yet until we get our lower mounting bolts started. For the next step, we'll slide our sandwich plate on the inside of the frame. I already fed one of these bolts through to help us line up our sandwich plate. Once I get that first bolt through the hole, I'll go ahead and slide our second bolt through the top hole, and we can cap these off with our nylon lock nuts on the inside of the frame. Once we have those started, we can grab our 13mm wrench and our 13mm socket and get it all tightened up. Once we have our 2 bolts started, I'll start by tightening these 2 M8 bolts before we tighten our OEM shock bolt, and then move on to the front side. With our rear shock relocation brackets installed, we can go ahead and move on to the front shock relocation brackets. As you can see here, we have various hoses and wires zip tied or plugged in to the frame tubes that our shock relocation brackets will mount to. What I'm going to do is use the same push pin removal tool that we used earlier on and unpin it from the frame. We'll need to have a nice flat surface for our shock relocation brackets to mount to. With all of our hoses and wires disconnected from our frame tubes near our OEM shock mounts, we can slide our front OEM shock relocation brackets in place. You'll have 2 identical brackets, and when you install them, you should be able to read the letters in the correct orientation. We'll slide this on the front side of the frame over to a friend on the other side. Before you put the bolt all the way through the OEM shock hole, you'll want to grab the long spacers from your kit and slide them in between your frame before using the long bolts supplied in your hardware kit to slide all the way through the frame. Before you cap it off with your nylon lock nut, you'll want to grab the other front relocation bracket, which again is identical, and slide it over the bolts on the back side of your frame. With both of our brackets in place, we use our 16mm socket and 19mm wrench to go ahead and tighten these down before we move on to the next step. The first step of our brake line install is we'll need to disconnect our brake pressure switch. The connector for this is located under the hood, so I'll cut these zip ties in these 2 locations, unplug the clip under the hood, and feed it back into the frame in this region so we can remove the brake pressure switch. Here you can see the connector for our brake pressure switch. You'll depress this tab down, which will allow you to disconnect it electrically. You'll hear it click. And then we'll use the same tool we used to disconnect our Christmas tree push pins earlier. You'll want to get this out and slide it down the hole so that it's closer to the master cylinder and will be free to rotate when we back the brake pressure switch out of the master cylinder. Here you can see I have the main front brake line disconnected. I'm going to use a 5mm Allen wrench to remove this socket cap screw that fastens the junction block for the front brake lines to the frame. Once I have this loose, we'll go ahead and remove the front brake line assembly and move on to the next step. Here you can see your brake pressure switch assembly. You'll have a crush washer followed by your front brake line assembly, followed by another crush washer in between the brake line assembly and the threads in the master cylinder that hold this all together. You'll reinstall this brake pressure switch with your new front brake line assembly, so make sure you set it aside and don't lose any of the pieces to it. So here you'll have the brake line kit that'll be provided with your U10 long travel kit. As you can see here, this short line goes from our master cylinder to our junction block, just like the OEM line. And you have 2 different length hard lines. Yeah. And then you'll have 2 different length braided lines. The short one will go towards your driver's side of the vehicle, and your long one will go on the passenger side. Just a reminder, when we're reinstalling the brake line assembly, you'll slide the brake pressure switch through this banjo joint with crush sleeves on both sides to seal the brake fluid. When you're installing your brake lines, you'll want to run your passenger, the long stainless brake line, over to the passenger side. Once you have your brake pressure switch and your crush sleeves in position, you can go ahead and thread everything into the master cylinder. You want to be careful to make sure that you're not cross-threading it. Once you get it all started, you can tighten it up with a 17mm wrench. Once you have your brake pressure switch tight, you'll want to rerun it into the hood. You'll be able to reach it from the underside here. Once you get it up and held in position, you can take the slack out of it and zip tie it to the brake hoses that go to your reservoir, as well as the frame tube. Keep them out of your radiator fan. Once you have your brake pressure switch harness zip tied to your reservoir fill lines, you'll also want to zip tie your junction block to the frame to keep it in position. This junction block mounts in a very similar position to the factory junction block. You'll simply take your zip tie, snug it up, and you'll be able to pull the junction block into place. Once you have your zip tie tight, you can snip off the excess. I went ahead and zip tied the passenger side brake line to the same section of the frame, just on the passenger side. This will be the same location that we removed the clamp for the factory brake line. So for the next step, we're going to move on to the tie rod installation. Here you can see the steering boot that'll be provided with your tie rods. I'm going to cut this smallest section off on the side that's in my right hand with the scissors. And I'm going to cut all the way up to this line here, leaving this remaining section for our hose clamp to seal the boot to the steering rack. This is what your steering boot will look like once you have it trimmed and ready to be installed. For the next step, you'll want to remove the jam nut off the inner tie rod provided with your tie rod kit. And you'll slide the long shank of the inner tie rod through the narrow end of the boot. It may be a little difficult to get started. You'll have to work the boot down over the inner tie rod. But once you have the boot over the long shank, you can reinstall the jam nut to hold the boot in place. You'll want to get the jam nut as far as possible down onto the boot so you don't lose any adjustment or thread engagement on your tie rod. Before we thread our inner tie rod into the steering rack, you'll want to go ahead and apply some Loctite to the threads. Once you have the Loctite applied to your inner tie rod, You can slide the hose clamp over your steering boot and thread the whole assembly into the steering rack. You'll want to go ahead and get it hand tight. Once you get as tight as you can with your hands, you can grab a crescent wrench or some channel locks and tighten it up all the way. Once you have your inner tie rod tight, you can slide your clamp back over the boot and push your boot so that it slides over the steering rack. This may be kind of tricky to get, but if you keep working the boot around the steering rack, it'll fully slide over and you can tighten the clamp up. Once you have your boot securely fastened to the steering rack, you can move on to threading your tie rod onto the long shank of the inner tie rod. Before you move on to the next step, your kit should have steering stops provided in it additionally. On this installation, we decided not to do it, but before you seal the boot to the steering rack, you'd slide the steering stop over the shaft of the steering rack to limit steering angle. Your U10 long travel kit will give you two options when you're purchasing it. You can either have Thumper Fab install the ball joints and bushings so that when you receive your kit, all you have to do is bolt it on your vehicle, or you have the option to reuse your OEM ball joints and bushings. To reuse your OEM bushings, you'll slide the bushings out of your factory arms and the pivot tube you can see on the inside and install them in your Thumper Fab arms. The process is similar for your ball joints. You'll remove the snap ring, press the ball joints out of your factory arms, and press them in the reverse order into your Thumper Fab long travel arms. With our tie rod installed, we can move on to installing the A-arms. With your front lower arm slid in between your frame tabs, you'll reuse the OEM hardware to fasten it to the frame. Before you slide your axle in the differential, you'll want to go ahead and apply some anti-seize to the splines just to make sure it doesn't bind up over the years of riding in wet and dirty conditions. You'll repeat the same process for the rear. We'll go ahead and slide this in the diff and move on to the next step. We'll go ahead and slide our axle in the front diff. You want to make sure that it's fully seated before we move on to the next step. Next, we're going to remove the lock nut from our lower ball joint, and we'll free our knuckle assembly up so that we can fasten our lower ball joint to the knuckle and slide our axle through the knuckle before we cap it off with our axle nut. With our knuckle lowered down, I'm going to go ahead and slide our axle through the hub. You may need to rotate the hub assembly to get the axle to slide all the way through it. And then I'll pull our lower arm up so that the lower ball joint comes up through the hub before I cap it off with our nylon lock nut. For the next step, we'll go ahead and install our front upper control arm. We'll repeat the same process as the lower. You'll simply slide it in between the frame tabs. You can slide your sway bar link out of the way, and you'll feed your OEM bolt through the cutout provided in the plastics. You may need to wiggle the arm around to get the holes lined up. Once you have the holes lined up, you can push the bolt all the way through the frame and the control arm before you cap it off with your OEM lock nut. We'll move on to the next step. While we're here, we can go ahead and slide our sway bar end link into the upper control arm. You may need to adjust the height to get it to fully seat through the bracket. We'll cap this off with our OEM lock nut. Move on to the next step. With our sway bar loosely connected to the upper control arm, I'm going to go ahead and fasten our upper ball joint to the knuckle. Once you have it fully seated, you can slide your lock nut in between the knuckle and the axle and thread it onto the ball joint. Once we have both our ball joints loosely started, I'll go ahead and fasten our axle nut to our CV axle. You'll slide the thick washer that was provided with your axle over the axle first, followed by the castle nut. You can thread all the way down, and we'll tighten it up with our impact before installing our cotter pin. With our axle nut tight, you'll take a cotter pin and slide it through your castle nut and the hole that's drilled in your axle. Once you have the cotter pin fully seated, you can grab the ends of it and wrap it around the axle shaft. You want to make sure your cotter pin is wrapped around the axle so that it can't back out of the castle nut. Here you can see the hardware that we'll use to mount our shock to our shock relocation kit. This washer will be located up against the back side of our shock relocation kit with the shock going in this void here. We'll go ahead and mount the shock to our shock relocation bracket, keep everything loose until we mount it to the arm. We'll move on to the tie rod. For the next step, we'll go ahead and mount the shock to the upper control arm. We'll reuse the factory hardware. Once you get the bolt slid all the way through, we'll cap it off with our nylon lock nut. Here you can see the misalignment with a tapered end on it. This taper matches the taper located on your knuckle to provide a snug fit. You'll place your tapered misalignment into the knuckle and line our tie rod bolt up so that it feeds through the misalignment. Then we can go ahead and cap it off with our nylon lock nut on the underside. For the next step, we'll fasten our brake line to our brake caliper. We'll reuse our OEM banjo bolt, and you want to make sure and have crush sleeves on both sides of our brake line fitting. Next, we can zip tie our brake line to our upper control arm. This will provide us a nice snug fit and keep our brake line out of the way of any rotating components. With our front all buttoned up, we can go ahead and move to the rear. The first step of the rear installation, we'll go ahead and slide our rear lower control arm in between the frame tabs and use the OEM hardware to fasten it. With your bolts all the way through, you can cap them off with your OEM lock nuts. For the next step, we'll want to go ahead and fasten our sway bar to our lower control arm. Just as before, you'll use your OEM hardware. Went ahead and got it in position. We'll simply slide our bolt in place and cap it off with the lock nut. With our arm loosely mounted to the frame, the next step, we'll fasten our sway bar to our lower arm. You'll use the OEM hardware. You may need to pivot the arm into place. Once you get the bolt all the way through, you go ahead and cap it off with the lock nut. Just a reminder, you want to leave everything loose until we get everything bolted up, and then we'll move on to the next step. I've already went ahead and applied anti-seize to our rear axle. I'll go ahead and slide it in the diff. Just like the front, you want to make sure it's fully seated. Once you have your axle seated, we can move on to sliding the knuckle over the spines of the axle. With our axle fully seated, we can go ahead and slide it through our hub assembly. Once you have your hub assembly and your axle fully seated, you can lift the lower arm up to the knuckle. Depending on if you have the sway bar on the other side, you may need to lower the knuckle. Go ahead and line your bolt hole up and use the OEM fasteners to loosely mount your knuckle to the arm. Once you have your lower knuckle mounting bolt fully seated, you can cap it off with your lock nut, and we'll move on to the upper control arm. The next step in preparation for your arm install, we'll remove this uppermost plastic push pin that's fastening your electric brake cable to the frame up here on the front side of the frame. It'll be a Christmas tree push pin similar to what you'd see on an automotive door panel. If you notice your brake lines seem tighter than they should be, you may need to remove additional fasteners to free up extra slack in your brake line. Once we get the upper arm in place, you'll see where the brake lines will zip tie to, and that'll give you a better sense of how much slack you need. For the next step, we'll go ahead and mount our upper control arm just before you use all your OEM hardware. For the next step, we'll go ahead and mount our shock to our shock relocation bracket and then the control arm. You'll use your medium-sized bolt out of your shock relocation kit. The smaller bolts in the kit are the M8 that we fastened previously. You'll want to slide the shock in between the upper control arm before feeding the shock in between the tabs of your shock relocation bracket. Once you have your bolt all the way through your rear shock relocation bracket, you'll cap it off with the lock nut found in your hardware kit. Just a reminder, you want to leave all this loose until we get everything started, then you can tighten everything up. For the next step, we'll go ahead and hook our upper control arm to our knuckle. You may need to pivot the arm back some. Once you get your bolt hole all lined up, you can feed the bolt through and cap it off with your lock nut. With our upper knuckle mount bolt started, we can go ahead and fasten our shock to the lower control arm. You may need to wiggle it around to get the bolt fully seated, and you'll cap it off with your OEM lock nut. For the next step, we'll install our axle nut and thick flat washer. You'll slide the flat washer on first, thread on your axle nut, and you'll want to tighten it up with an impact using a 30mm socket. With your axle nut tight, you'll go ahead and install your cotter pin through the axle and the castle nut. You want to make sure and fold the cotter pin over so that it won't let the castle nut back off. I've gone ahead and removed the OEM clips on the brake lines. The last step, we'll zip tie them to the provided tabs on the control arms. You want to make sure that your brake lines aren't too tight, but just enough to keep them snug on the arm and out of the way of any rotating components. You can see where we've attached the liquid brake line that has your brake fluid in it to the two tabs on the upper portion of the upper arm. Here you can see the power wire for the electric parking brake is zip tied on the side of the control arm. This lays out best so that when it gets to the caliper, it matches the factory orientation. With all of your brake lines secured, the only thing left to do is set the vehicle down, bleed the brakes, and set the tow. You're ready to hit the trails and enjoy your new Thumper Fab U10 PRO long track.